Hey guys, so a few weeks ago I took part in a game jam. This was a 72-hour jam that was put on by the SoloDeveloper community, and it ran from Friday 2 p.m. to Monday 2 p.m. The goal was to create a game in line with a specific theme, and that game would then be judged by our peers on 4 categories: creativity, gameplay, theme interpretation, and polish. I usually build my games using Godot 4.3 using C# instead of GD script, but I had to use Godot 3.5 because Godot 4.3 does not support web builds for C#. This created some difficulties because I was not aware of the subtle differences, and trying to figure them out during the game jam was pretty much a pain. But I still got through. Also, because I was rushing myself and I was panicking a little, I had to use the Godot text editor instead of Visual Studio Code, which the Godot text editor is very nice to have, but it is just not as good as Visual Studio Code, and it actually bogged down some of my work. But really, I have no one to blame but myself, because I wasn't ready for it and I wasn't paying attention. Other than that, I was set up for the game jam and ready to go. At 2 o'clock, the theme voting was tied between Under the Surface and Hot and Cold. I didn't have any ideas for Hot and Cold, so as I was praying to God that they would choose Under the Surface, they announced that you could do either theme, so kind of a win. Being from the Midwest, I immediately thought of an ice fishing game, leaning on my knowledge of ice fishing to create a fun game. Unfortunately, the only time I went fishing, I fell in the water, so that knowledge was pretty non-existent, so I knew this was going to be an uphill battle. To start with, I grabbed some sprites that one of my friends had made for one of my previous projects and started using those as placeholders. I did not have a lot of experience with user inputted movement, and this was kind of going to be the crux of the game, and so I really didn't want to mess this part up. After about an hour of playing around with the movement and then reading the documentation when I couldn't figure out how to do it properly, I got the character to move how I wanted, and I was also able to get the fishing reel to move downward consistently. Then I took a break from coding and decided to make a fish sprite. I was going to be creating a lot of them, so I wanted to have a good process for it. This was the first fish I made. If you can't tell, that's a puffer fish. It was made freehand with no reference at all. Being a human being with moderate critical thinking skills, I knew that any fish I made in the future could not look like this. So I started looking online and using picture references and ended up with this next fish, which is apparently a tuna. Now that I had a process for drawing fish, I grabbed my new tuna and started implementing it into my game. First, I had to get the fish to move. This was really easy. I just set up a script for the fish to move back and forth between 2 points on the X-plane all the time. Then I had to make sure that the hook could catch a fish, so it would detect when it hit the fish. And honestly, this took the rest of the night. I had never done any work with collision boxes, and I just kept throwing stuff at the wall until I read the documentation, and that helped me figure it out. Now that the fisher could move, my fishing reel could move, and the system would detect that it caught a fish, I started building my functionality around that. I'd begun this project with ideals of object-oriented programming where the fishing reel would handle itself, and then the fisher would handle themselves, and all the fish would handle themselves, and everything would handle themselves, and there would just be one simple script holding it together. And that was going well until I actually had to start implementing functionality, and then I just started throwing everything in the main scene, until the main scene eventually became a 1,000-line abomination. Next, I needed to figure out how the upgrade system works. The only 2 upgrades I knew I was going to have was making the fishing spot wider, and then also making the fishing spot deeper. After playing around with it a bit, I was able to come up with slower fish, faster fishermen, and then getting more money for fish because video games play to the unrealistic power fantasy where you can actually get more money for the exact same fish. And I wanted to contribute to that one specifically. The next problem that I had to tackle in my game was fish generation. I had to come up with a system to randomly generate fish throughout my lake. I'm going to go pretty in depth about this because this is probably the most fun part of the jam for me. So fish are spawned every 50 pixels going down. We have a function that takes in the depth in pixels and then outputs a fish and or trash at that specific depth. Next, I generate the x coordinates for the fish and or trash for it to go between, and then I randomly add plus or minus 25 to the y coordinates so they don't spawn in like a full line. There's a little overlapping between them. I'll also slightly change the speed and size variables just so then they're not all the same and they're not all moving in the same way. Now I'll explain how we choose whether to generate fish or trash and which fish we'll generate. First off, it decides right away trash or fish using the trash percent variable that can be modified as you upgrade it. The process for generating trash or fish is exactly the same. The only difference is where you'll be grabbing it from, whether you'll be grabbing it from the trash stack that we have or the fish stack that we have. The lake is split into 13 sections depth-wise, and each fish has a certain rarity in each section. The higher the rarity, the more likely they are to appear in that section. For instance, the bass has a higher rarity near the top of the lake, but the rarity goes down to 0 near the bottom, and the eel is basically the opposite. For trash, it's basically the same. The trash bag has a high rarity near the top of the lake, while the gold bar has a higher rarity near the bottom of the lake. Then it adds up all the rarities for the fish at that specific depth, and then picks a random number and grabs that fish that correlates to that random number. Then we make a duplicate of that fish and return it in the function, and say it's been generated and give them a thumbs up. After that, I created most of the fish sprites. I'll be honest, some of them look good, some of them look bad. I actually take that back. Really, just the pike is the only good one. The rest of them are pretty meh. But as the saying goes, a good artist blames their tools, so I will be blaming myself for this poor artwork. One thing you'll notice about the ice and floor texture in my game is you'll notice it's the exact same as a background I made for a different game, and that's totally true. I just changed the colors of the background to fit the ice and the bottom of the lake. The last thing I had to do for the day was generate an upgrade menu. This was super simple when I just threw everything in the scene script and said I'll figure it out later if there's issues. So, it's good coding. I woke up on Sunday and realized I was mostly done with the game. I just had to create like actual menus, a victory screen, and a credit screen, and that was really it. These menus took more time than I thought because Godot 3.5 has a different UI system than Godot 4.3, so I was more confused than I usually am. I started out with trying to make the menus look really pretty, and then eventually I just convinced myself that polish wasn't that important. And what matters was I finished them and made them functional. I nixed some trash/fish I didn't want to make because I was getting really tired of making sprites, and I was also losing a lot of energy towards this project. I added some sounds because I wanted to show myself that I could at least add sounds, and I'm not gonna lie, that was a confidence booster. Then at about 2 o'clock, 24 hours before the deadline, I decided it was finished. I had added enough and it was time to throw it up on the web. Here's where I had some difficulties, and after only a few tries, I figured out what the error message cannot find index.html meant, and that meant I needed an index.html file. So after fixing that problem, I threw it up on itch.io and submitted it, and then decided to relax for the rest of the day. That is, until some of my friends played it and found game-breaking bugs that I had to fix. They also commented about my design and some issues with the upgrade system and how things weren't consistent. And so instead of watching football on Sunday evening, I spent it fixing bugs and tweaking numbers to get the proper upgrade scaling. Eventually, it came down to only one game-breaking bug that I couldn't resolve. And for some reason, it got stuck thinking that it had caught a fish multiple times and just wouldn't stop. And then when you started a new day, it would lag out because so many fish had been generated. And like any good developer, I decided to leave this for future me and just went to bed. When I woke up the next day, I started just rationalizing it's okay to have a game-breaking bug. AAA studios do it all the time, so I should just be okay following in their footsteps. And I kind of tinkered around with the solution, but didn't really finalize anything until about 1 p.m., an hour before the deadline. After testing out the solution once, I decided it was good enough and entered it as my final build about 45 minutes before the deadline. And then it was time to play the waiting game. Now, anyone who submitted something for the GameJam had a week to play and rate all the other games. So I got to work playing the other games in the jam, and honestly, a lot of them were fun. Even if they didn't have a lot of work or polish or were slightly broken, you could tell a lot of work and care went into them. Big shout out to my favorite game, The Leidenfrost Dilemma. I love dual platforming games that seem like they come from the mid-2000s, so I was really pulling for that one to win. At the end of the week-long rating period, the results were in. I had gotten 13th out of 49 games, and I was pretty happy with this result. I was mostly paying attention to getting the 6 in gameplay, so I was really happy with that, because I knew my polish, creativity, and theme interpretation were probably not going to be the best. I was surprised that my theme interpretation was so low, but that's probably just because I'm from the Midwest and I just go ice fishing. Everybody likes ice fishing. But, maybe I didn't play to my audience right. Anyways, the Game Jam was super fun, and I'm going to try and do more in the future. Big shout out to the SoloDeveloper community for putting this Game Jam on. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.